So this week I want to talk about act structure just because, I've been thinking about writing a lot lately. Writing is so important, whether it's, for any storytelling. Writing is really important. And understanding what you're doing, why you're doing it, doesn't matter if you're a natural or not. It's very important to understand, what at least everyone else is saying. If someone comes at your story, they take it apart, and they say, I don't like XYZ, it might be completely invalid stuff that they're saying, but you have to be able to communicate as to why, that's invalid or why you think they're misunderstanding your story. So, yeah, and I have Jaboy Shakespeare on the screen right now because I may not, read Shakespeare in my free time or anything like that. And, the Shakespeare I have read, it's not like, Shakespeare in the stories in and themselves like are so captivating that, they affect me on a personal level really that much. It's that if you take it apart on a technical level, Shakespeare is just the GOAT. And that's like, understanding that he very intimately understood mechanisms of story is just very interesting at the very least, even if you come away with this saying, well, this is all hogwash, I'm just going to write things the way I want, which is fine too.
Is that a hyperbolic goat, or is he literally the goat of the three act? Well, I assume we're going to talk about three act structure, right? So
yeah, I'm not a lit person, entirely. So I don't know if I can make that claim. I don't know if I'm qualified to make that claim. But as far as I can tell, even things that I've been skeptical about in terms of learning Shakespeare as to what applies to storytelling as a whole, and then it clicks later when I'm like, oh, I get it. Like that completely makes sense, and this is better. Yeah, so that's my experience, but I don't know if I could say he's literally the GOAT or not.
yeah.
I know there's a constant debate whether or not he's even unique in his time period or like blah blah blah. I have no credentials in that field.
Didn't Shakespeare mostly write in 5 acts though? So you kind of saying that like he's combining, in a 3-act structure, like each act spans multiple like literal acts.
Well, actually, the core of my point here is that no one in the modern world really understands what an act is. Like they just say I'm writing a 3-act screenplay, and that just doesn't really mean much when they say that. That just means that they had a vague understanding of what box they were going to put their film in, and then they just crammed a story into it, not understanding what they meant. And so, yeah, no, I don't. Shakespeare is not a 3-act story guy, and that's actually why I think he's so interesting. Because it's like, well, why is it so engaging? Why is it so much better in terms of coming out with impactful thematic writing and stuff like that? And when you understand that he understood that story is extremely flexible if you understand its components, you understand why he can write a 5-act thing pretty effortlessly and you don't get bored at act 3. Yeah, that's what's interesting about him for sure. But before we go to Shakespeare though, I wanted to mention Hitchcock, which I am going to study eventually. I'm going to study Hitchcock. I am set on it. I have a set on my shelf right now that I will consume. I just haven't gotten to it yet. But some Hitchcock quotes, because Hitchcock has said some interesting things. He's an interesting guy in general. But one of my favorite things that he said, and it's kind of a theme of his philosophy of cinema, is tension is the lifeblood of cinema. And I think a lot of people think about that a little bit too specifically. So here's a quote from him, actually. I just think this is interesting. He says, "There is no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it." So, he gives this great example of if there's a bomb underneath someone's chair in a conversation, and the audience doesn't know about it, neither character knows about it. It's just a conversation until the bang happens, and then it's just surprise. which is a sort of ephemeral emotion, which maybe that's what you're going for in that particular moment. But if that's what you think is going to drive, interest in your film, that ain't it, Whereas perhaps the audience knowing that there's a bomb there and the character's not knowing, or maybe one of the characters knows, but the audience doesn't know, all those things can create tension, and that creates interest. But if we broaden that understanding to be a little bit deeper, I think what he's getting at is that at all times in your storytelling, you want there to be attraction, attraction to something. Tension oftentimes is attraction towards the answer to a question, or attraction towards experiencing the next beautiful moment. I think we can broaden our understanding of what he means by tension. So these are things like we can have attraction towards justice, right? Wanting to see justice done for a character or something like that. Attraction towards wonder. So like, simply exploring a new world can be a type of tension because you want to spend more time in that sort of wondrous place, you can have attraction towards love, love of all kinds, and seeing how those loves interplay with each other. Attraction towards tragedy, right? Like we understand when something wrong has happened and we want to see what happens to that person, that is wrong. We start to care. Attraction towards fear, so the list goes on and on and on as to what you can use as your tension. It really is infinite, right? And thus it's really just the understanding that you can't just string a bunch of moments together and say, oh, look, I have a great story. You have to be constantly reaching towards something with your story and asking your audience to come with you. Something that's a little bit deeper than just, oh, look, she walked down the street just because we have to get her to go to the coffee shop so that she can talk to this person. What are you reaching towards is the question. If you don't have an answer, maybe you should think a little bit deeper about why you even put that scene in, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess we'll start here. So what do you guys think is an act? If you guys want to guess at trying to define what an act is.
To think about that one, because I had an idea for a story for a future video game, and in my mind there are 3 acts, and the reason being is 3. Okay, I shouldn't say I don't know if I necessarily consider these acts. I consider them parts, right? Because it'd be a trilogy, right? And all of the games are centered around different sort of source, like a different problem, I should say, right? Different source that's moving the story forwards, I guess. Different goal. Yeah, I guess that's what I'm trying to say. I don't know. Then that makes me wonder: is it? I feel like this is wrong though. That an act is defined by the goal that the character is trying to reach.
That's interesting. What do you think, Ben? You have any thoughts?
It's some like unit of the story that sort of has its own arc, but is leading towards like a broader arc. So you have to have some kind of like opening, some kind of like motion forward, I suppose, or like, tension and some sort of resolution, but it may not resolve like that, what happened there, but like resolves that sort of scene, I suppose, and leads into the next thing without like, feeling like a full stop, I guess.
Yeah, no, I like that too. Yeah. And I think you guys are probably closer than even some screenwriters, believe it or not. I've read some interviews from some Marvel screenwriters and some other screenwriters. These people get paid a lot of money for their screenplays to sit in a writing room, and when they talk about acts, they're actually less coherent than that. What either of you guys have said. So yeah, that gives you a landscape of, do people in Hollywood necessarily understand what they're doing when they're writing? maybe not necessarily. Maybe that can explain why the movie that you anticipated being good and you were like, oh, you had all these tools in front of you, ended up being bad because they tried to shove it into something they didn't understand. So I mean, I'm not the authority on what an act is, but I like this definition from a very influential article that I read years ago that just changed the way I thought about writing entirely. The author of it is called Film Crit Hulk. And this person's actually a film critic and has written several books. So the person's actually pretty prolific. So the definition of an act to Film Crit Hulk is: the end of an act is a point in the story where a character makes a choice and can no longer go back. And I know from reading more of from this person, more of their writing, that I think what they're really trying to get at, because this person writes really informally, so I don't think you're supposed to parse this definition into, very particular terms or anything like that. What really they're trying to get at is that there's something irrevocable that happens at the end of an act. That can take a bunch of different forms. So it can be a character's choice. That's one way to think about it. But some movies don't have a main character like that. Or some great stories don't have a main character like that. I mean, Shakespeare is like that as well. So it's really that, okay, a character can make a decision that's irrevocable. Or it can be that there's something that's thrust at the entirety of a situation that is irrevocable. Whether this is, sort of a natural thing or a random thing or whatever it is, something irrevocable happens. The story would never have been the same if XYZ hadn't happened. There's actually, I just thought of this, but Breaking Bad is, if you want to learn, you want to see someone who really understands act structure, watch Breaking Bad and break down the acts the way I said, per show and per season. And you'll understand why that show is compelling back to back to back to back. And doesn't matter how much you explore these very small themes with this set of characters. It could be a small episode about the internals of each character, or it could be a more action-packed episode. And either way, it is just as driving for you to watch the next one because of the way that it's structured. So that's what an act is, and I don't think that's helpful enough. I think it's more helpful to understand how things. Let's visit the traditional 3-act structure. So I've got a picture here I'll put up on the screen. If you're listening to audio only, you could probably search like 3-act structure and come up with a picture very similar to this. You've seen it in like middle school or high school or something like that in your writing classes. So at the beginning you have your it's like that pyramid, or not pyramid, like slopey thing. So at the beginning you have your exposition, then you have your inciting incident, then you have your midpoint, then you have your rising action, then you have your climax, then you have your denouement. So that's the traditional way of teaching how to tell a story. It's weird that they teach you how this is how you tell a story, but then you go ahead and read literature in class and like basically nothing follows this order that you read in class. Maybe like short stories that are very simplistic, they'll like pick some like, classic short stories, canonical short stories that fit this, but the writer understands like how to do that properly. And it actually comes off well, but you don't read novels that really follow this pretty well at all. This is the traditional 3-act understanding from like a movement of the plot perspective. And I really do think that when especially in the US, this is a big problem I have with how people consume movies. It's what I call like, a little bit of a vulgar term, but plot whoring, right? It's like when everything becomes about the plot, it becomes about what's going to happen next episode, or man, that plot was just so easy to read. It's like when you hear people saying that about stories that are not plot driven, it's bizarre but I think it's because we think this way. We think, oh, how are we going to move forward from X to Y to Z point to get to the end, blah, 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 blah. When stories that are really compelling don't even really work that way. That's not the reason why you care about point B or C. It's because there's a whole plethora of things happening that engage you. So yeah. So what's wrong with this? So first of all, exposition. Who likes exposition? Like seriously, like what about exposition is compelling or good or interesting? Nothing about exposition. Usually exposition's a dirty word in writing circles, but yet right here it's something you're supposed to do in act 1 apparently, and you're supposed to expose the audience to your world for a whole act, which that's a great way to bore your audience pretty much immediately. And the way this happens typically badly. I mean, the typical way people do exposition is they'll have a couple of characters go around and say their names to each other, and then they'll talk about their situation and blah, blah, blah. Shakespeare doesn't do this whatsoever. Like, it's actually pretty crazy if you read Shakespeare, how little exposition there is in any particular point of Shakespeare, but yet it's everywhere. Why? Because he lets the entire story expose the atmosphere. Romeo and Juliet's a great example, actually. Do you understand the family feud that is going on just from the first act of the movie? No, you don't. You don't really fully understand the depth of it. He doesn't give you any background whatsoever. In fact, in class, they usually give you the background before you read it, but that's not how it's written. That's not how it's written at all. And, this is a fictional thing going on. So, I mean, if you're watching the play, you don't know the intricacies and dynamics of each character and how they relate to each other at the beginning, but he just drops you right into it, drops you right into the story. You don't need it. You don't need to dump exposition at the beginning. Why? Because you can soak it in as you go. There are, of course, none of this is like hard rules. There are some kinds of stories where there's going to be a little bit more exposition pocketed in particular spots than others, but that's a whole different discussion.
I'm just thinking like a film example, like, not to dwell too much on Star Wars, but the first Star Wars films, I think a great example of that. Like, yeah, you get a little bit of the crawl, it gives you some like bare bones context. It's like, no, we're in the middle of the space fight.
Yeah. Yeah, but yet too many stories, they'll be like walking around to each other and saying, oh, this guy's bad and this guy's good, and you have to learn how this particular mechanic works in this universe and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, wow, you're really just going to take me to a tutorial of this universe, aren't you?
Every live action Disney movie I've ever seen, like specifically ones geared towards like teens, it's like they're in high school or whatever, and then everyone's like comes up to one another and talks, and like, it's clearly an introduction to each character one by one, showing off like their unique trait that makes them interesting and quirky or something,
And then you get like films that like where they think that they're not doing this, like Iron Man. It starts with like, the whatever the incident is in the like Iraq desert or Afghanistan, and then you get the exposition. But no, we're so edgy because we started with some action first. Like,
yeah, actually, that's something that screenwriters talk about. It's like, oh, you might want to put a hook before the exposition. It's like, no, your entire film's a hook, you idiot. Like, like from minute to minute to second, you should be justifying to the audience why they should keep watching. That's what you should be doing. Iron Man actually, ironically, I think is probably one of the better executions of this. I'm not saying it's particularly, it's not like the best film ever, but if I were to say a film that,
don't think it is.
No, I think it's a pretty average film, but like, I think out of the Marvel movies, it actually does this graph probably in the top 5, pulling this off. Because I think it was written more intentionally like this, whereas the rest of them are trying to copy Iron Man, if that makes sense. But anyway, so then we have to get the inciting incident. So there's apparently one thing that happens in life that catalyzes stories, like just one local moment, apparently, that just like, oh, then the story just blossoms from this local moment. It's like, that's bizarre. Like, that's pretty weird. In fact, that might
This really
feel
is just
pretty
a Disney
forced.
live-action movie.
Go ahead. What did you say?
I said this really is just a Disney live action movie right here. It's like some school event. That's really what it is, right? Some school event, and then like at the start, like it's like I think it's always like this. Some character walks up to a poster, is like, "Have you seen this event that's happening in 2 days?" And it's like, "Oh wow, wonder where the story's going." So yeah,
Exactly. It's like, wow, I guess there can't be any more things that compel the plot forward, I guess, anywhere else in the story. It just got to happen all at once right here, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, so that's Inciting Incident. Then there's the midpoint, which is always the most vague. I don't know, like midpoint seems to always to me just pointing out that this is the halfway point in the film and has no concrete definition. It's like, okay, well, Inciting Incident and Rising Action have a big chunk in between them that you have not defined what's supposed to go there. And I'll get to that in a moment because that ends up becoming a pervasive problem in like so many films. Then you have the Rising Action, which is like, wait, so there wasn't tension before this? Like, like, shouldn't there just be tension everywhere? Like, why is tension ramping up now? So, and the way this gets interpreted a lot by writers who are not very good at implementing this is like, we got to make the audience care about our characters first until we get to the rising action. You what? You know, like, if you care about, and if you think about the Romeo and Juliet example again, you just jump right into it and you immediately care. You immediately care, not necessarily because you know these people immediately, but there's intrigue everywhere. There's tension everywhere. You know, from line to line, there's tension. You know, what does that mean? What does he mean by that? How is he going to respond to that kind of statement? And it's like, oh, well, how does that connect to the larger thing? And oh, this new character came out of nowhere, and like, how does that relate to this whole situation? And it's, wow, the fate is telling us that, you know, like all of this is rising action, I guess, if you want to use that term, although I think that term is useless. If you think about it in a Marvel movie, this is the point when we start getting rising action. It's like, oh, we've now assembled the crew, and now we've got to attack the problem. Now we've got the ticking time bomb or whatever the heck is going on, and now we've got to sit there with our fists clenched and scared as to what's going to happen at the climax. It's like, okay, I guess you could write that way. And then you get the climax. The climax is supposed to be the reason you watch the movie. And I'm not exaggerating. Like, when I read people, and this is when I was more naive about screenwriting, I would read these articles about, you know, writing stories, and people were talking about the climax as if it was the jewel of the film. Like, meaning if you don't get this right, the film is bad. And I'm thinking to myself, this is 2/3 of the way into the movie, is it not? So if I don't care about if the rest of the movie was garbage, but the climax is good, you think I'm going to walk away with the movie like happy with the 2/3 of my life that I've wasted, 2/3 of the movie, you know, that I've wasted my life on? No, I'm not. In fact, I probably won't even appreciate what is a good climax if the rest of the film was bad. The other thing is, like, a lot of times this midpoint thing that they talk about is supposed to provide some sort of setup for a twist that's supposed to happen in the climax. And the thing is, if this twist is not engaging or interesting or surprising, then it just doesn't work. And that's a big, like, bet to take on, like, very, like, undefined, you know, understanding of story structure. And then there's the denouement, which apparently we're supposed to release all that tension for like half an act or like 2/3 of an act or something. This is the part of the movie where we're sitting there like watching the characters essentially debrief to you all that they went through. And it's like actually weird when you think about it. I think we're really used to it, but it's actually pretty strange. It's like, you don't have to tell me all over again what happened or why we should care for like another 10-15 minutes. Like, you know, the action is over apparently by the end of the climax. If there's nothing else interesting, then the story's done. Like, there's just nothing else to explore. If you want to connect something back to me, just tell me. Like, if you want to hammer home a point, do what Shakespeare does. Just put a freaking like, aside at the end of it and just literally tell me in like 1 minute the summation of why I should care for my own personal life about this story. Or if you want to add that poetic flair, just do it in 2 minutes. Don't spend a whole act on it. That makes no sense.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And a good example of like not doing like the wind down at the end for a really long time. Like I noticed this after watching Inception. The movie just ends. It happens. The big climax happens, and then there's like a couple minutes left, and it's over. Oh, actually, that's not quite true. I'm forgetting about this a bit afterwards, but it's definitely a fast like decay, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of. It doesn't quite decay at the end, like not to spoil it, but like, yeah, I guess it never completely winds down like that, and it happens pretty fast. It just goes down and then goes right back up at the end, and then that's kind of it. Yeah.
Actually, Nolan films are actually great. Great if you want to understand like better three. There are all 3-act screenplays, but they don't follow necessarily this dumb way of interpreting a 3-act structure. There's nothing wrong with 3 acts, by the way. 3 act is just the number of acts you have. There's nothing wrong with having 3 acts. It's bad when you understand it as beginning, middle, end. That's when it's bad. And I think in Inception, it's a good point. Is that there's an idea he's getting at, and he waits until the last moment, because guess what? There is all the way up until the last moment tension. There's still tension. You had the climax, but there's still tension because there's this one question the audience wants to know still. One question left. And the last shot of the film leaves you with tension. The credits are rolling and you still have the tension. And that's much better way of writing a film. Although I think that movie has problems with exposition at the beginning. That's a whole other problem. A whole other thing.
One, I just had to point this out because the 2 films I watched recently, like the polar opposites. So I watched Chinatown, which we talked a little bit about last time, which is like does not follow this rigid model at all.
Nope.
And is fantastic. And then I watched Hook, mostly because John Williams' score. But you guys, the epitome of like following this to a T and being a really bad movie, except that it has some nice tunes.
Yeah, I've heard really bad things about Hook.
It really is not worth your time. You could just listen to the score and you've gotten every good bit out of it.
Yeah, this structure is probably... I have no idea who thought this was a good idea to teach in school. I don't even know where it comes from. I should do some research as to what the history of this like graph is. It's just bizarre to me in retrospect. And I'm just lucky that I came across the article that sort of like turned me around and made me think about Shakespeare more and like, okay, what is that like and all that stuff. I feel like I got a little bit lucky. So then we get into the Marvel interpretation of this graph. Marvel, like I said, Iron Man kind of follows this like to a T, and it's probably a good example of following to a T that's not the worst. Although, again, I think it's a pretty average film. But Marvel has 2 different templates. One's the Iron Man template, and the other one is the... I believe it's the first Avengers template, which is not just reserved to the Avengers movies. They use it in like single movies as well. I can't remember if that's the first one that uses that template. They're explicit about this. You can go read screenwriters who write for Marvel that they're very explicit that we have 2 templates. Every movie can be fit into one of those 2 templates. Marvel movies can get these critiques from film critics where the middle part was boring. I just wanted to get to the end. And so how did these screenwriters respond? They look back at their trusty 3-act play plot and they're like, what is that midpoint anyway? And then they make it this graph that I'm going to put on the screen. This is what they fix it with. Sid Field is a very famous screenwriter who probably wrote better screenplays than anyone who reads him will produce using these dumb rigid models of his. I think his models are bad, although he probably wrote better than his models because he probably fit into these models much more naturally than people who are just trying to copy him. But so here we have, the inciting incident again. We've got the plot point 1, pinch 2, plot point 2. So, but basically, the thing that you have to take away from looking at this graph is that, for those who are listening, audio only, is that Act 2 is now split into first half and second half, which is apparently supposed to fix your midpoint sag, which I think is the term that people use. That's supposed to solve all your problems. And what is supposed to solve your problem? Pinch 1 and pinch 2, which basically means you're going to try to force tension into those moments by saying some problem needs to be solved in pinch 1 and a separate problem needs to be solved in pinch 2 so that we can get to the climax ultimately, which is the jewel of the film. And throughout that, through pinch 1 and pinch 2, if you don't learn something new about your characters and your audience is not sympathetic to your characters and cares about what's going to happen, then your whole film falls apart. That is how they try to solve the midpoint sag in Marvel movies. They know this is a problem. Like I said, they publish blogs about it. And this is a problem. This is not just Marvel movies, by the way. If you go read film criticisms, you will see the most common critique: the middle of the movie was boring. The middle of the movie dragged. Why is this the case? This is the case because there's no reason for the middle of the movie to be there. You could have probably just cut out the middle, showed the beginning and the end. It would have been a 40-minute movie, but it would have been more compelling that way. And it could have been a 2-act film. And there are 2-act films out there. And it can work. But they don't do that because they think beginning, middle, end, and something's got to go in the middle. And so, so then you get the Act 2A and Act 2B sort of thing that is very commonly talked about. This doesn't really work, as I said, and if you don't have a good twist, then it's all for naught, apparently, and blah, 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 blah. But you guys get the point, essentially. So,
why are we so concerned with twists? I mean, is that just like the obsession with I don't know, like Darth Vader, being Luke's father kind of thing? Like,
yeah, that's what you're supposed to chase after, apparently, is because that's why they think that moment is compelling. It's because it's surprising. That's not why it's compelling. It's compelling because there was tension backing it. Right, and it complicates everything too. Right. Yeah, it's what I call plot whoring, where you're just concerned with what happens instead of literally everything else about life that makes life interesting, not just what happens. So, and how predictable it is. Like, how predictable is this plot? Who cares how predictable it is? I've watched many movies where I'm like, I know where this is going, but it was engaging, or some, even better, movies that are extremely predictable objectively if you look back on it, but you didn't think about that the entire time because it wasn't about that. Who cares? Here's the thing, my overall point in a nutshell. If you listen to people tell stories in real life at a bar, at a restaurant, just your friends tell stories. They tell stories in acts, and they will add on acts until their story is done. They will talk about, let's say they went on vacation. So I had a friend recently who went to Roatan, and I had dinner with them recently, and they were telling us stories from Roatan. Some of their stories are one act, essentially. There's no the beginning of the story is just right into why we are caring about the story, and by the time they're done with their anecdote, they've reached something that has changed everything, which is, let's say the situation is resolved. So let's say the story simply they lost their bags in checking or something like that. And it's like, how did they lose their bags? So they go through that whole thing, but then what ends the story is what makes that no longer a story, right? Which is, oh, we got it, we found it, or whatever it may be. Or they'll tell a story in 10 acts if it's like, that kind of story. Well, they'll talk about, okay, this is what we did this morning, which is its own sort of act in and of itself. Then something that caused this to happen, that forced the next piece of the story, and they'll tell it. They'll just keep adding acts. You'll do this if you're, well, I mean, some people are not the best storytellers naturally. That's fine, but a lot of really engaging, storytellers, when they're telling stories to their friends, they'll just make acts naturally. And it's not a very rigid thing. And film crit Hulk points this out. Shakespeare has acts within acts in a way, if you want to look at them that way. You can even find like act structures happening, within dialogue, like where by the end of this conversation, something has evolved either to the audience or the characters, such that at the end of that conversation, the act is propelled forward in a very particular way that is irrevocable, like I said. So let's see, what's a good example? Weird example, but I wrote an article about this, so I guess I'll plug it. I'll put it in the description at some point. But I watched the movie 10 Things I Hate About You, which is based off of a Shakespeare play. I'm gonna mess up the name. And the thing that it's like a typical rom-com in every way but story structure. And the story structure is compelling because there are characters who have different acts within their arcs. So like if I take out the main characters and I separate them out, actually there are two main characters. So if I take each of their characters and I pull them out of the story and I write down what happens to them, their themes that are important and all that, and I write it out in a timeline, that character will actually have different act structure than their counterpart, who's the main love interest, who is also a pretty big character, will have a completely different act structure. If I put them on top of each other, I'll find that their acts, when important, line up and end at the same time to sort of synchronize their propulsion forward. This might happen one time. I think in 10 Things I Hate About You, I think it only happens once when they actually line up. So if I split it like that, okay, I can see two overall acts for these two characters alone. If I look at it from like a God's eye point of view, like the audience point of view, there are, I believe, 4 acts I think I identified in 10 Things I Hate About You. That might be slightly modified from the original play. I'm not sure. But there are 4 acts in 10 Things I Hate About You from that perspective, because we have Fate's Eye, which Shakespeare loves to exploit to create its own tension, that we know things that the characters do not, that imply tension in scenes that otherwise would be mundane, everyday action, And so there's this beautiful breadth of ways you can analyze story that is not just like, okay, this is a 4-act film. You can look at it in many different ways. This act can have essentially 3 acts inside of it. It's not the same thing as Act 2 having part A or part B. That's just not understanding what acts are. But this sort of way of thinking about it can really free you up to tell stories any way you want to. David Fincher does this. David Fincher does not write 3-act stories, except for Mank, which as far as I've seen his films is by far his worst film. It's a terrible film. So, well, that tells you something. I haven't seen this movie yet, but this is a famous example. Girl with a Dragon Tattoo, if you want to check it out. Girl with a Dragon Tattoo is famously an example of a film that's an incredible 4-act film. And you can sort of feel the acts as you go along. And it has 2 characters, very Shakespearean. Each of those characters are essentially main characters, but they kind of swap who's important as the film goes along, instead of saying, oh, this is the main character and we're just going to fixate on this person, and this is just sort of the co-lead, that kind of tags along with our main character. That's not bad necessarily, but the point is that Girl with a Dragon Tattoo shows you that you can do it in such a way where there's neither one of them is really a main character, and it really depends on where you are in the overall story, and each of them has their own act progression. It's a really freeing thing. So yeah, I think the final thing I want to say has to do with Shakespeare's way of ending his stories, which is often what film crit Hulk calls the grand moralization. This is not necessary in your story, but it is something that is way too uncommon in films these days. And I think it has to do with the what's the word? Like the sort of postmodern like sort of interpretation of story, where stories are just stories and that's it, or stories are there to ask only questions, which I love films like that. I write films that ask questions and sometimes don't have answers to them. That's fine. The problem is that sometimes the film would be better if it did have an answer to the question. And that last bit of poetic moralizing, that 1 minute of soliloquy, would beautifully round out a gorgeous film. And it's just not very common at all. Here's a great film that does this. It's a film you wouldn't expect to. Fight Club. Fight Club does this. Fight Club has a bunch of asides in it in general. That's a David Fincher movie, so he's a very Shakespearean writer. And the characters talk to the audience, literally. And at the end of it, there's this great, grand. This is not talking to the audience. It's just written, into the nature of the film. Great little dialogue. It's about maybe 30 seconds long. That the film would not be the same without. You would not walk away without that piece, understanding what the film meant properly in the way David Fincher wanted you to understand how it meant, what it meant. And I just think that's sad. So yeah, that's pretty much all I had to say. That's story structure 101-ish. Go research more is really my point.
I feel like a lot of times films direct for like younger kids do a better job of this. Like as well, I watched Land Before Time recently. I feel like it does a much better job of doing like story structure, but also like you said, like that kind of like last like kids movies in general like have that little bit of moralizing. And like it'd be really silly like if you watch like a whole bunch of kid shows, but like it also be done really well. The end of Land Before Time, like we get great dinosaurs live peacefully because they all learned to be friends and had like hope in their dreams, kind of thing. Like what it'd be nice. I agree. It'd be nice if we had some more of that.
Yeah, and it's like it's kind of reminds me of the whole thing about like what appeals to adults versus what sounds childish. It's like, well, it's not childish if you do it well. Like there are plenty of great films and great stories Great Gatsby. That's a great example of literature that has just at the end. What is it? It's a poem, essentially. At the end of Great Gatsby, boats going ceaselessly into the past. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you care about if you agree with the sentiment that Fitzgerald is sharing there. It doesn't matter if you agree or not. That story is not the same, to me at least, without that last page of the book, which everything before it is a lot bigger and longer, but this gives it a context that sort of sends it towards the transcendent. Oh, this is the thing I want to say. There was something on the tip of my tongue.
Yeah, go ahead. Running a long time, just saying.
Okay, yeah. I'll just say this last thing. The biggest tension that you could ever create in a film, going back to Hitchcock, is within the audience. It's within the person who's watching it. It's not within the characters on the screen or what's going to happen next. It is often, could be moral tension. It can be a whole host of different things that are much more fundamental to the listener than, just what's happening on the screen. And what that moralizing does is it can actually increase that tension beyond the film's duration. And that's incredible. It's an incredibly powerful thing that you can do as a artist in general, is impact your audience that way. So yeah, that's my last thing.